All right, so now that we've seen a brief demonstration of how our data is segregated according to user in our application, the next thing that we're going to do is allow users to create new accounts through the Create Account page. Now, before we jump into this, what I want to do is add a logout button to our application because currently we're kind of stuck logged in as John unless we go into incognito mode. And, at some point we're just going to have to allow users to log out of our application. So, in order to do that, we're going to create a logout button and we're going to add that to the nav bar. So what I'm going to do here is in the front end, in our components folder, we're going to create a new component called logout button. And it's going to be a pretty simple component. We'll just say logoutButton.js. Inside here, we're going to import the getAuth function and the signout function. And those are imported, of course, from the Firebase/auth package. And once we have those two things, we're going to say export const logout button. And this is just going to be a very simple button. What we're going to do is say return. It's going to just be a button here that says log out. And when this button is clicked, it's going to actually sign the user out. So we'll say onClick equals, and we'll define our own function up here that will be log out. And all that's going to do is say await, sign out, and pass the getAuth function to that, like that. And that's pretty much all we need to do. Our routes should take care of automatically routing the user back to the login page once the user is successfully logged out. So let's pass this logout function to our logout button now. And let's add our logout button to our navbar. So let's open up navbar. We're going to import our logout button component. And once we've imported our logout button, we're just going to say logout button and display that inside of there. And now all we need to do is we're going to go to index.css here. And we're going to add display flex to our navbar. And we'll also add justify content space between. And that should take care of spacing out our heading and our logout button, right? So we see that our heading is now all the way over to the left-hand side, and our logout button is all the way over to the right-hand side. Okay, so we can click on the logout button if we're logged in, of course, as we just saw. Let me just log in here real quick to demonstrate again. We can click on the logout button now up in the nav bar, and that will automatically send us back to the login page. All right, so now that we've allowed our users to actually log out, and this will allow us, of course, to see the Create Account page, let's talk in a little bit more detail about what exactly needs to happen when a user creates an account. Okay, we already saw what can happen if we do it wrong, right? When we just added that user directly to the Firebase auth in our Firebase auth console, we saw that that actually caused an error on the server because we didn't have a corresponding user for that ID in the users collection in MongoDB, right? So in other words, we had a user over here. That's the way I'm drawing a user here, I suppose. Basically, whenever a new user is added to Firebase auth, which I'm just going to draw as this box here, we need to make sure that a corresponding user is created over here in our users collection that will basically keep those two things in sync. Right now, the user in Firebase auth has an ID that Firebase automatically generates for it, right? It's a big long string of numbers, letters, etc. And that's going to be what we use to link up the users in our users collection with the users in Firebase auth, right? So each of our users here is basically going to have that ID property, as we saw, that's equal to this property here. So essentially what we need to do is whenever a user creates a new account, we're going to need to both create a new user in Firebase auth, we're going to need to get the ID of that new user we created, and we're going to need to create a corresponding user object in our collection. So we've kind of seen this process earlier when we added create account functionality to our friend tracker application, but this implementation here is going to contain a few, sort of special cases, so to speak. So let's take a look at what this is all going to look like. All right, let's go back here to our code. And what I'm going to do here is open up the create account form, or the create account page rather, that we created. And we already have this create user with email and password function being called. But again, as we've seen, if we actually do this, this will end up causing errors once the user is logged in because we won't have corresponding data in MongoDB. So what we're going to need to do here is get the ID of this user we just created and make a request to our backend with that ID saying, here you go, we want to create a new user now. Okay, so what this is going to look like is we're going to say const result equals await create user with email and password. And this is going to give us a lot of information about the user that was just created in Firebase Auth. Now, among that information, of course, is going to be the user's ID, which is what we'll be sending to the server. And we're also going to get the user's ID token to make sure that it really is a new user that logged in that's creating the new item in the database, right? And this is necessary, right? It's necessary to send along the user's ID token because otherwise anybody could just send a request to our server saying, hey, create a new user. It'll probably look something like this, post/users. And they could create users in there in our database that don't actually have a corresponding user in Firebase Auth. So in order to prevent that, we're going to have the user send along their ID token and only allow them to create a new user if that ID token is actually valid. Now, this will also allow us to make sure that the email property that we're setting on our users in MongoDB matches the email in Firebase Auth. And the reason for that is that we can get this email property of a user from the ID token when we say verify ID token on the server. You'll see what that looks like shortly. So now that we've gotten the result of calling create user with email and password, the next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to say const token equals await result.user.getID token. All right, now you might be wondering why we're getting the token here when we have perfectly good functions inside that one hook that we created that automatically include the token in the headers. Well, the reason for that is just because of the way this is all working and the fact that we're calling this create account function before the user is logged in, we wouldn't actually be able to use those functions because, as we saw, those functions have to update to reflect the current user. All right, so what we're going to do here instead is we're just going to get the token by calling result.user.getID token, and we're going to use Axios here directly by saying await. And here, let's actually import Axios up at the top. Import Axios from Axios. And here, let me just put this thing down on the bottom there. I usually like to have my relative imports below my actual package imports. Just a preference of mine. We're going to say axios.post, and we're going to send a request to a route that we haven't yet created, which is going to be /users. Basically, just like we can send a post request to /notes to create a new note, we're going to send a post request to /users to create a new user. So the actual request body of this is going to look like this. It's going to include the user's ID. So we'll say user ID result.user.uid. And that's pretty much all we need to include for now. The rest of the information we'll be able to get from the header. And that's going to look like this. We're just going to say headers auth token token. All right. So once we've made that request to the server, we should be all good to go and send the user to the notes page, which will probably be blank for them at that point. All right, so now that we've modified this create account function to take into account, no pun intended there, the new flow and the fact that we actually need user data behind the scenes in the database, what we need to do is create this corresponding user's route for creating new users. Okay? So let's open up our backend and go into source and routes, and we're going to create a new route in here, which will be called create user route.js. Oops, and I put a space at the beginning of the file name there. Thanks for letting me know, IDE. And what this route is going to look like, we're going to say export const create user route equals, and just like other routes, this is going to be an object. And the path here, as we've already established, is going to be /users. The method is going to be a post request. And we're going to have the handler here, but also we're going to have middleware for this route, which will take away the responsibility of actually verifying the ID token from this route handler. Now, if you recall, earlier we created this verify auth token middleware function that takes care of verifying the auth token that was sent along with the request and setting the user that corresponds to that auth token on request.user. So what that allows us to do inside create user route, well, first of all, we're going to need to add that middleware. We'll say middleware, And we're going to put in the verify auth token middleware there. Here, let me just change the quotation marks on here. And now we can simply access the user's information by saying const auth user equals request.user, and we know that the information on there is legit, right? We know that that contains the actual email address of the user. We know that that contains the actual ID of the user, so we don't really need to do anything else. And actually, now that I say that, we don't really need to send along this user ID in the request body, right? We can just say headers auth token, and for the body here, we'll just put an empty object, and then we'll just be able to get the ID for the new user from this request.user thing. That's a little bit safer of a way to do that as well, since we know that that can't have been tampered with. Cool, so the next thing we're going to do now is insert a new user into the user's DB, and for that we're going to need to import the user's DB by saying user DB from /db. And then down here what we're going to do is say const new user equals, and we're going to create the new information for this new user by saying ID. The ID property here is going to be the auth user's ID property, or UID property that is. The email is going to be the email on the auth user, so we can say authUser.email. And we're also going to insert an empty array for notes. Okay, so that's our new user object. Next, what we're going to do is say const result equals await user DB. Oh, this should be users DB actually. There we go. I named it wrong up there. Glad I caught that one. Okay, so users DB. Oops, that should be users DB. There we go. Dot insert one. And we're going to insert the new user into our user DB. All right. So now that we've done that, we have this result. And this result contains the inserted ID of this record that we just inserted into our database. So in order to send back to the user the updated user information, what we're going to do is say response.send, or response.json rather, and we're going to insert all of the information from the new user, like that. And additionally, we're going to add the underscore ID property, which will be result.insertedID. Okay, so that'll send back to the client side the complete new user object, so that if the client side needs to do something with it, it can. Now, as it happens, we're not really going to need to do that right now, just because of the way our application works. But nevertheless, it's a useful thing to send back just in case we need it. So that should be all we need to do, the basics at least, for our create user route. There are a few more things I want to add to this shortly. So let's export this from our index.js file. We need to do that in order for this route to actually become part of our server, remember? And what I'm going to do is keep the note routes separate from the user routes, just by putting a space in between them. So let's say import create user route from its file, and we're going to export it. I'm going to do the same thing here and say create user route. And that should add the create user route to our application now. Okay, so let's give this thing a try. What we're going to do is try creating a new user from our create account page. So let's, I just need to restart my application here because I was getting that one error that we see from time to time. And it looks like our server's running correctly, and it'll open up our front end, and we should be able to create a new account now. So let's try creating a new account. We're going to say john2@gmail.com. We're going to have the password be abc123, same thing for the confirm password. And now if we click on create account, we should be automatically navigated to the notes page, and we should see that we have no notes currently. All right, so let's test out adding a note now with this new user. We're going to say, hello, this is my first note. We're going to create it. Sure enough, that one is there. We can edit this note and say, I'm not sure what to write yet, but this is fun. Click Save Changes. Looks like updating the note is working. And of course, if we want to delete it, let me just actually create a new note here called delete this. And we can delete that by clicking the delete button. All right, so everything's working with this user. And if we go and take a look at our Mongo database, which we can do by just saying db.users.findall.pretty, we should be able to see that john2@gmail.com has a link to the note that we just created. And if we go into our notes, we're going to say db.notes.findAll.pretty. We should see that that note is in there and that it was created by the user we just created. Okay, you can see that by looking at that user's ID there. And that's how we allow our users to create new accounts. All right, so that's obviously a very important part of any application, is allowing users to actually create new accounts, because we're not going to just go into Firebase Auth and create them manually all the time. Now, there are some more things that I want to add to this, however. One of those things is we need to make sure that a user doesn't already exist with that email address. That could cause a little bit of confusion, as you might imagine. So the way that we're going to prevent that is we're going to start off by finding if any users are in our database with that email address. And the way that we can do that would be by saying const existing user equals, and we'll say await users db dot find one, and we want to find a user whose email property equals the auth user dot email property. And if that user exists, we want to make sure that we don't accidentally create a new user with that email by saying if existing user. All right, so if there's already an existing user with that email, what we're going to do is send back response.status. And the status code that I usually use for this kind of situation where we just want to say that something already exists is 409. So I'm going to say response.sendStatus 409, and that will send back an error to the client side saying that that user already exists. Okay, now on the other hand, if that user doesn't exist, then we're free to create this new user, insert it into the database, etc. We do want to make sure, again, that we add the return keyword to response.sendStatus so that it stops everything after this from executing. And in fact, I've already done this return thing a few times already, but you might actually want to just put everything else inside an else block to be safe, right? You don't have to, but that's something you could do if you wanted to make extra sure that nothing else executed after returning some kind of status code. Great, and what we'll see now is if we try and create a new account with an email that already has an account, all right, we're going to log out here and say john2@gmail.com and try it again. Oh, here, let's try creating an account. There we go. We're going to go to john2@gmail.com. We're going to put in a password again. And if we click on create account now, what we should see is we're going to get this auth email already in use thing. And as a matter of fact, this is coming from Firebase itself, right? Firebase auth doesn't want duplicate emails either. So in most cases, this logic here will never be called unless somebody is maliciously trying to insert new user data into our server, or if our database somehow gets out of sync with Firebase auth. Now that shouldn't happen, and there are different ways to prevent that from happening, but for now, this is good enough. So anyway, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.